G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and I hope that you've had a brilliant start to the week. Happy Monday. Now legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. Now I'm trying to keep these videos short, but they just keep getting longer and longer, so I do apologise. So we will be looking at the maps. We don't have that many map updates today, but we will show you some geolocations of some changes as well and some important areas. And then we will talk about, with Putin yesterday saying that he's open to having a meeting with Ukraine in Turkey, and then US pressure looks like then Zelensky has accepted that. At least it somewhat looks like that on the surface. You're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong, but my interpretation of what he has tweeted is that he will only go if there is a ceasefire. Again, I'm not really sure on that. We'll go over that in whole. But with all of this, we need to look beyond surface level. We need to look from a perspective of realpolitik, what is realist, what is idealist, what is just fantasy. But we need to look at that they're very smart people behind the scenes here, and why are they doing this, maybe knowing that things will fall apart or not then be accepted by the other side. Remember, diplomacy is chess, not checkers. So we'll go over that, I guess, in depth. We also need to look at some information I've been sent about drone targeting. But where I want to start is this video here by Mr. Cappy or Cappy Army. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are aware what has happened recently to the former channel and now the new channel. And I think a lot of people, including myself, were shocked by that. And I wish Mr. Cappy all the success with the new channel and that endeavour as well. Fantastic. But this video here called US Black Ops in Europe is legitimately insane. And I just wanted to talk about this because a lot of people ask me about it. And if you ask me enough, well, you ask and you shall receive. Now, personally, I think for myself and probably people that watch me a lot, there's no huge surprises in this, but I think a lot of people will see what was once held as a conspiracy and then has come true in many, many cases. But I just want to add some context and maybe some of my perspective or knowledge on some of this as well. Now, what I will say first off the bat is no one should be surprised when special operations teams are doing special operations missions. I don't think anyone should be surprised by that. And I think we've covered most of this. So the main points I think that he hits on to do with this conflict, and he goes a lot into the history with the Yanks and the Soviets, and I think it would actually be really good. I'm not sure if he has read it, but there's a book called The Sword and the Shield, and that touches on the declassified Soviet documents, and you can actually see a lot of parallels happening here. But to do with this war, then US directly guiding strikes onto Russian targets. And we have spoken about this at length. This is why initially in the war, we saw such successful targeting of senior Russian staff. SAS, of course, referring to Brits here, in Kyiv to exfil Ukrainian generals. Not surprised by that. Western soft training since 2014, as well as other training elements and continuing through. I don't think anyone's surprised by that. CIA operating bases at the front since 2014. Again, at what was once conspiracy is now just accepted as common knowledge. We've seen this come out over the time too, and realistically, we know how then great power politics works and the leverages you try and push. No one should be surprised by this. One of the bits that he touched on, which I actually didn't know, what I thought was very interesting, but there's a very similar case as well, was that Ukrainian intelligence personnel staff, they killed a Ukrainian commander on his way to a meeting. That meeting was with the CIA after the CIA was not impressed that what they were then taught was used in a lethal sense. And it actually very similar happened very early on in the war to a politician who was acting as a negotiator, who Ukrainian intelligence services actually thought was a double agent, but it turns out that he wasn't, and he was dumped on the streets in Kyiv. Now, bits that I'd add for Cappy, and I've actually put together a whole email here at length and sent that across, but I understand that he is super, super busy, so we will see. I won't be offended if I don't get email back. That is fine. But a few bits I'd touch on this a bit further is special forces intelligence services, of course, there's a lot of overlap in this, working in counter-espionage in a lot of areas in line with the Ukrainian intelligence services as well. The drone boats, of course, these drone boats were, for the whole time, heralded as this domestically produced item, wonder weapon, whatever. On the back end of that, anyone who knew anything about the military R&D complex, all of this, knew that wasn't really to be the case. There was a lot of different fingers in pies there too. But how recent articles have come out that this may have somewhat jeopardized Taiwan's defenses, because originally a lot of these boats were to be used for that, and now counters are getting developed against that. Also, different agents, as well as recruitment of people to collect Russian equipment or have images of Russian equipment on the front lines and either take that back to probably the States or to at least a handler somewhere. The pushing of propaganda campaigns, everything from leaflets to online, and all of that operating as well. And this isn't really intelligence, I guess, but the moving of valuable equipment to the front line. And there was a lot of contracts early on in like ex-military circles. These contracts were going out to move highly sensitive equipment to the front line, not as military staff, but as ex-staff with experience to move that forward. So say javelins needed to be moved to the line. Initially, it seemed like there was a real mistrust of handing that weapon over at the border and where it may end up. And there was huge contracts of guys to actually deliver that then to the front line. So fantastic video. I just wanted to add my 2 cents because a lot of people asked me. Now, I've done my very best to verify this as much as I can, and I do that with all information that I am sent across. But remember, in very early 24, late 23, I had a friend who I know well who's working within the Ukrainian forces. He reached out to me speaking of Russian drones collecting a lot of data and then using that data to triangulate Ukrainian positions. And he sent over basically like information of how to try and counter this, because that is happening. And I got sent across this, and I've done my very best, but again, with everything online, grain of salt, but it tends to line up here. Now, to business, I didn't sign an NDA for this, a non-disclosure agreement, so fuck it. I'm under no obligation to not speak about it, but I work in IT. I worked for a Russian company, and that project that I worked on involved the development of an autonomous drone for data and signal collection. Now, essentially, it would guide itself through the camera via an autopilot that we developed to avoid obstacles, while never flying higher than 100 meters or 300 feet for people with a foot fetish. It would have an antenna to collect data, mainly signals coming from transmitters on the ground, or a repeater for drones. And with more than 50% of battery, would fly back in friendly lines, always with more than 50% for a margin of safety. And this is exactly what my other contact, who I know very well, was telling me on the ground, is there's drones flying over with antennas, collecting information. And if it can see like a blob of forces here, blob of forces there, triangulating, right, well, why would there be this blob happening here? And of course, these repeaters have to have a large amount of radio frequency that you can pick up as well. That's why in modern warfare, even with GPS, you never leave like your Garmin on. Turn your Garmin on, get your grid location, turn your Garmin fucking off, shoot a bearing on your compass, and then move and do it again and again as you need. Since GPS would be highly jammed and unreliable, that's why it's going via a camera autopilot. Thus, people can go over the footage and do geolocation. So co-locating that footage too, and then correlate with the signal strength from multiple flights and pinpoint the location of transmitters or the repeaters. So image here, geolocate that, and how strong is the signal as you're going. To not only potentially focus jamming, so focus your electronic warfare, but also ideally destroy and locate the origin of drones, as it was assessed that most drones would come from the same path, which was thought by Ukrainians as safe enough for being too far from the usual range of artillery and drones and most threats, use of repeaters as they go. Most repeaters and transmitters aren't moved often, if at all, by client information, and that's something to keep in mind. People will point out that destroying a repeater or transmitter with a FAB glide bomb will be very likely be the least likely target, but drones and ARTI are another story. And the idea of the project, I have no idea what they will do with the information, if they will even do anything at all, but Ministry of Defences during wartime do not tend to waste money on things that they won't even try to consider that might be important. So especially at wartime, try to be as efficient as possible to knock out some of those areas. As the drone threat to the Russians is probably their number one concern, which I agree with, since Ukraine lacks other systems to compensate, as per my understanding, which I agree as well, that the Russians do have other systems to compensate for the drones, such as FAB, such as an artillery overmatch as well. But if Ukraine were to lose those drones, like we've spoken about Starlink, big problem. So the idea here is to get an idea and triangulate where those positions are and knock out those then transmitters and repeaters as they go. We developed and field tested for the client. The results were quite promising. I don't know if it's or will it be implemented, but it's something to look for if you see that drone teams are being targeted or if drones become less useful in the coming future. So very interesting there too. And again, grain of salt with that, but it does make sense to try and get overmatch in all areas is what you're trying to do at war. And Ukraine's most important product here, other than men on the front line, is their ability to employ drones to make up for having a artillery or undermatch, as well as not having any sort of analog for things like glide bombs. I know that there are analogs, but not in the numbers that are needed. Okay. So let's have a quick look at the maps, then we'll look at Putin, Zelensky in Turkey, whatever's going to happen there. So we'll turn onto the deep state map. We'll turn that on. So the red check is ground that Russia has made by this map in the last 24 hours. But we have Ukraine and Kiev in the center of your screen, the capital. We have the red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. And we'll belt feed through this. We see just to the north of Rozliv, south of Serberne, some area coming under control here. Again, nothing shown on this map today is different from what Syriac has shown for, say, a week, and Syriac and AMK don't have maps out today. So I think that this map is likely just catching up on some stuff, as well as when we come to the northeast of here, or the eastern flank of Pokrovsk, the Tatasivkia front, we see further expansion in this area. Again, exact areas that Syriac, AMK have shown as under-occupied for some time. So that is all that we have on the maps as far as changes, but still advances going on. Now, every time I talk about Vovchansk, I say that I think we're very unlikely to see movement through here, because at the end of the day, regardless of artillery and missiles and whatever, the line at the front line ultimately is still moved by combat forces, and they still need cover to move, and Vovchansk has just been so flattened to just nothing, as we see in an image like this one, that it's almost going to be impossible to get any movements here unless you're against a seriously degraded force. But we are going to look at one interesting thing. So we've got to pick right up out of the map. We see Kiev here, and then we go northeast, and we're looking for this prong here. And what we're looking for is this Hermakia area in here too. And terrible pronunciation of the area. And we see this geolocated footage here of Russian forces taking control of the border crossing and then putting up a flag as well. This bloke climbing up that. Firstly, I've seen the videos of the guys who were targeted by drones while climbing up these, and I want nothing to do with any climbing of any ladder in combat scenario, and flying the flag there. By the kit out here, these do look like fairly like reconnaissance or SF troops. You get a pretty good idea looking at kit if you know what you're looking for. And the geolocation of this is just on the border crossing point here. Of course, not used anymore. But minor crossings like this, these are expected, as the defensive lines for both Russia and Ukraine, they sit further back from the exact border. And I expect Russia to do this more and more in areas as their numerical advantage has led them to use a strategy developed by then the Russians in World War I, known as Brusilov offensive action. So you push across many different areas of the front line to have simultaneous and successive attacks. And what you're trying to do here is, when you're fighting a numerically smaller opponent, is to force their movement of reserves into an area to try and stabilize it, to move frontline troops from an area to try and stabilize it, and keep them sort of on the back foot running around and never being able to stabilize every different sector. So I'm not surprised at all to see Russia at the moment on, say, 10 different axes, all of which we go, well, which is the major one? But that's the whole point, is you don't have a major one that you can put all of your forces at. This is why many criticized really the Western plan of Ukraine pushing really hard in the Robotne front, Ottoki front line during the 2023 counteroffensive, because you push in one or two areas, then they can just bring all their forces to bear in defense here. And we are seeing Russia do that across a whole broad front of minor little chomps away as it bites down in their offensive campaign. So you can't ever stabilize the entire thing. This is what you get when you are numerically superior and fighting a numerically inferior force. The best example of this is when Ukraine pushed into Kursk. It gave Russia a perfect opportunity. If you remember back then, I said the best defensive move for Russian commanders here is not to redeploy forces up into Kursk to stabilize it, but to double down on your offensives in the Donbass and make Ukraine then redeploy to defend those more important areas. And that, by the kilometre squares we saw change, absolutely was the case. So let's go over Putin, Zelensky, Turkey, Trump, everything that has occurred. So what we did see is Putin say that he is ready for negotiations, not a ceasefire, negotiations to begin in Turkey, of course mediated by Erdogan. And Trump has said this, that Putin of Russia doesn't want to have a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, but rather wants to meet on Thursday in Turkey to negotiate a possible end to the bloodbath. Ukraine should agree to this immediately. At least they will be able to determine whether or not a deal is possible. And if it's not, European leaders in the US will know where everything stands and can proceed accordingly. I'm starting to doubt that Ukraine will make a deal with Putin, who's too busy celebrating the victory of World War II, which could not have been won, not even close, without the US have the meeting now. So again, he's sort of pushing on everyone here, but saying Ukraine, they need to do this, that he doubts if Ukraine will really make a deal with Putin, and then sort of kicking Putin in the nuts as well, with saying that then no one would have had victory in World War II if not for then the US. Now, what I will say is, even if with the biggest if ever a deal is made here, it'll take Trump approximately this long to claim that it was all of his doing overall. And then we do see that Zelensky, he has then tweeted out, this is his first tweet down here, we await a full and lasting ceasefire starting from tomorrow to provide the necessary basis for diplomacy. There is no point in prolonging the killings, and I'll be waiting for Putin in Turkey on Thursday. Personally, I hope that this time the Russians will not look for excuses. But this is where I'm a little bit confused on this paragraph here, is we await a full and lasting ceasefire. So does a ceasefire need to go into place before you meet with Putin on Thursday in Turkey? I don't know. I know Trump would be very disappointed if Zelensky doesn't end up going. But what Zelensky says is, starting tomorrow, we await a ceasefire. This proposal is on the table, a full and unconditional ceasefire, one that lasts long enough to provide a necessary foundation for diplomacy to significantly bring peace closer. Ukraine has long proposed this. Our partners are proposing it, and the whole world is calling for it. We await a clear response from Russia. So again, it sounds like if the ceasefire doesn't go in, he's saying there's no foundation then for diplomacy. Russia will have to end this war anyway. The killing must stop. Ukrainian forces will be ready to respond symmetrically to ensure fairness. We have repeatedly heard from our partners that they are prepared to strengthen sanctions against Russia if Putin rejects a ceasefire. Time will tell. So what you're asking for, though, you're asking for an unconditional ceasefire while rearming, remobilising, potentially more sanctions with no budges there too. So you're only asking compromise from then the more powerful party currently on the front line of Russia. Here in Ukraine, we have absolutely no problem engaging in negotiations. We are ready for any format. I will be in Turkey this Thursday, May 15, and I expect Putin to come to Turkey as well, personally, and I hope that this time Putin won't be looking for excuses as to why he can't make it. What I will say is, to be fair, it wasn't Putin who destroyed the first negotiations in Turkey. We are ready to talk to end this war. Thursday, Turkey. President Trump has expressed support. All the leaders support this. Not only has he expressed support, he has really been pushing you in that direction too. Now, this is all in response to what Putin said yesterday, that he's ready for direct negotiation, not ceasefire, in Turkey. But what I will say to Zelensky is currently it is illegal for Ukraine to negotiate. So I'll be very interested to see how then Russia respond to this, because if it is illegal, the fear is that any agreements that could be signed could then be seen as illegitimate in the future. Now, if Zelensky and the coalition of the willing are going to Turkey thinking that the talks are going to start on their 30-day ceasefire terms that we went over yesterday, this is a non-starter. Don't bother with the jet fuel going there. But if it does happen, the world leaders, they will be watching this. What I will say is when we're talking globally, the West is the exception, not the rule. And we are a very, very rich and influential part, but we are still a very small part of the international community. And these other partners here, they are looking for who is rational and looking to come to a realistic settlement to end the war too. Really, the countries we're talking about here is India and China. And if these leaders think that you can ignore the entire battlefield situation and rely on your views and ethics and what you believe is right to be the deciding factor in negotiations, I would say strap in and strap on, because you're about to get fucked. So let's continue on this. And this is where the political theatre comes in. Macron and Starmer both have reiterated that Ukraine has agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, no strings attached. And in my opinion, there's no way in the world these guys, I hope, are delusional enough to expect that this will actually work with Putin. That this is all just political theatre to try and get the world to say, and those countries sitting maybe on the fence or neutral, to try and say to them that, look, we tried to negotiate peace terms from an unconditional base, and it was Putin who would not budge to try and find a solution, so this will have a two-pronged effect. Knowing that this will likely fail, what they're looking for is firstly to sell or to justify more spending to Ukraine, to their domestic populations, and attempt to swing any neutral countries onto their side and away from Russia, okay? And I believe that this was clever wording of the unconditional action of this, clever wording to sound reasonable, but presenting something that you know that your opponent will never or can never agree to. So let's go over how I see this from, I guess, where Russia and where Putin is going to be then negotiating from. Now, we need to be clear. The front line, Putin's forces, they hold the initiative, they hold the momentum, and they're not going to give this up in a goodwill gesture. They're not going to give up their leverage for no compromise on the other side when they are currently the winning party on the battlefield. And the thing is, no realist or transactional leaders like Trump are going to expect this either. It doesn't matter what he puts on truth dot bloody whatever it is. He's not going to expect Putin to walk away from all of his leverage without any compromise on the other, less powerful on the battlefield side currently. So we need to be clear about this, that Ukraine, they're pushing for a 30-day ceasefire, is not a sign that they want peace. It's a move to try and level the playing field before they take part in any sort of negotiation. This is strategy. It's not sincerity. This is accepting that Russia has the upper hand on the battlefield and trying to get into a place to at least level that at the moment. They know full well that negotiating with Russia while they hold the initiative on the battlefield, it means talking with a gun to their head, like with the power imbalance at the Minsk agreements and then Istanbul as Russia was moving as well. So they don't want to then repeat that. So instead, what Ukraine is hoping for and what the coalition of the willing countries are hoping for is that they can hit pause, and while they strip Russia of its leverage, that they can then regroup, rearm and rotate and end up talking from a similar level, not what we'd see at the front line. And that's exactly why Putin does not want the ceasefire. In realpolitik terms, this is about freezing the front while it favours Russia. What this would give Ukraine is it gives Ukraine time. It gives them time to stabilise the line, bring in more Western support, and potentially even be strong enough to walk away from talks entirely. Like we saw in Turkey in 23 was the promise of enough support to walk away from talks. As Mr. Kissinger said, the weak grow strong by effrontery. The strong grow weak through inhibition. And Ukraine is playing to this and trying to flip the script in the battlefield of which is then going in more of Russia's favour, and I believe going in their favour actually in a more slippery slope event horizon way. But this all relies on Russia being blind, and Russia isn't blind. And from their perspective, the ceasefire is a trap. It's asking them to give up their momentum for nothing in return. And that is not how power works. As Professor Mearsheimer puts it, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Russia is doing what it can. Freezing the war now means handing Ukraine a breather and defeats the entire logic of fighting in the first place and trying to get the upper hand in these areas. And this is why Putin, he's just not interested, and he's been through this rodeo multiple times. Pause the war. The West just floods Ukraine with ammo, gear, gives them breathing space, rotation, mobilization, and diplomacy gets shelved the moment where Ukraine thinks that it can win again, because we know their goals and there's no way they're going to move on anything other than 1991 borders, just like we saw happen in Istanbul. Now, until that core contradiction gets resolved, one side wanting talks to stall the war, the other side wanting the war to pressure talks, is meaning that nothing serious is going to happen diplomatically. This is theatre. Reality is that power talks and peace waits. To quote Big Surge, the sword predates and transcends the pen. Negotiation as such must bow to the reality of the battlefield, and no amount of sharp deal-making can transcend the more ancient law of blood. Again, the gulf between where these two states would even look at ending the war is just so unbridgeable at this time. I don't think that we're going to see any real ending here. And what the coalition are willing is they're trying to present something as reasonable by the language used, that reality shows that in any negotiation is very unreasonable to expect then the more powerful party on the battlefield to give up all of their advantage while you give up and compromise none of yours. It's not like you're saying, then we won't deliver systems while this is happening and we will lift sanctions while this is happening. No, just you give up all of yours and then try and paint to Putin's allies or neutral countries or just other countries involved that it's you who's not prepared to do this. So there's a lot more games being played here, and sadly these games being played while many men die on the front lines and the situation deteriorates further and further. At the end of the day, I don't think that these are going to come to a successful outcome at all of these talks. If anything, it may actually be further apart after these. But it will be interesting to see Zelensky and Putin potentially face to face. Legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.